They didn't just steal my dock. They stole the last piece of my wife. That old wood platform by the river wasn't just a place to fish or launch a kayak. It was where she and I used to watch sunsets, sip hot cider in winter, and where her ashes were scattered under the willow tree beside it. So when I saw Karen from the HOA standing next to a backhoe with a clipboard and a smug grin, pointing right at it like she owned the land, something in me snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't run over and make a scene. I just walked back into my house, closed the door, and whispered one promise to myself. If they wanted a river fight, they were about to learn what happens when a retired civil engineer gets mad. I bought the property 30 years ago. Back then it was nothing but wild trees and an old fishing shack barely clinging to the riverbank. My late wife, Ellen, and I spent years transforming it, planting native flowers, restoring the dock, and eventually building a small but beautiful home that backed right onto the river. The river wasn't just scenery. It was our lifeline. Every memory we built seemed to involve that dock somehow. Ellen would sketch there. I taught our godson to fish there. It was where we had our last anniversary picnic before the cancer took her. After she passed, I added a simple bench with her name carved in the wood. It was private. It was peaceful. And it was ours. That all changed when the HOA was formed. A dozen homes sprung up downstream over the past decade, forming what they proudly called the Willow Creek community. It started small, annual block parties, welcome baskets, and the occasional loud grilling session. But then came the committees, the bylaw amendments, the mailed flyers titled Important River Use Update, and of course Karen Wilmington. Newly retired from a long, beige career in upper management, Karen moved in across the bend and immediately appointed herself president of the HOA. Nobody else even ran. Her mission in life became micromanaging everyone else's. Karen didn't like that I wasn't part of the HOA. My property was technically outside their jurisdiction, grandfathered in before the Willow Creek homes were even built. I paid no dues, attended no meetings, and followed no rules. That drove her absolutely mad. She once left a printed copy of the HOA's landscaping rules taped to my mailbox with a passive-aggressive note saying, "For your awareness, neighbor." I ignored it. I ignored a lot of her nonsense until the day she took it too far. It started with a notice. A bland envelope slipped under my door claiming that the HOA had voted to reclassify the riverbank for community use, and that the dock on my property was now considered a shared amenity. I laughed. I thought it was a bad joke. But then came the next letter. This one was more official-looking, complete with a fraudulent-looking map showing my dock somehow within the HOA's boundary. I crumpled it and tossed it. But the real punch landed 3 mornings later. The rumble of machinery woke me at sunrise. I stepped outside in slippers and flannel, still groggy, only to see a yellow bulldozer rolling down my path toward the water. Men in reflective vests followed behind, carrying saws and hammers. Karen stood at the front like she was leading a Roman legion, barking orders and waving around that same forged map. I demanded they stop, and one of the crewmen, clearly just a hired contractor, told me he was authorized by the HOA to remove an unauthorized structure on community shoreline. I tried calling the sheriff. He said it was a civil matter. I showed the deed. Karen said the area had been rezoned for shared access. I could have stood there all day arguing, but it wouldn't have mattered. The dock came apart in loud, splintering sections, falling into the water like broken bones. The bench with Ellen's name was tossed onto a pile of debris like trash. Karen had the nerve to smile at me and say, "Maybe now you'll join the meetings." That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my den, staring out at the ruined shoreline, her bench gone, the water looking bare and violated. I remembered something Ellen used to say when city developers tried to push her around back in her environmental law days. You don't beat the flood by building walls. You change the flow. That stuck with me. And as I sat there, I realized something chilling and powerful. I could change the flow. Literally. I spent the next day driving to the county recorder's office. I pulled records, boundary surveys, hydrological maps, Everything from the earliest platting of the land to recent erosion studies. I found two things that shocked me. One, my property line actually extended slightly further upstream than the HOA had claimed. And two, the entire Willow Creek development had been built on what used to be classified as a red zone floodplain, altered during a questionable land transfer deal a decade ago. Meaning, their houses only stayed dry because of the way the river currently flowed. A small, legal redirection of that flow, say upstream, wouldn't just be possible. It would be devastating. I kept my face friendly at the next HOA event. Karen was holding an outdoor wine tasting on her front lawn, complete with rented white chairs and tiny flags with her initials printed on them. I walked by and nodded politely. She gave me a look like I was an ant on her croissant. She had no idea I had already filed the preliminary permits for what I was calling a water retention and erosion control upgrade on my land. The county agent didn't bat an eye. After all, I was just maintaining my property and conserving river flow integrity. They had no idea the real plan. Back on my land, I started making preparations. I measured grade angles, scouted the topography, and walked the banks with a laser level. I marked off the route in red stakes and flagged the trees I'd need to clear. The best part was, I didn't need to dig deep. Just enough to guide the flow into a newly carved path that would bypass the Willow Creek docks entirely and feed back into the main river further down. It would be slow. It would be subtle. And once it started, nothing would stop it. The river always obeys gravity. And I had just given gravity a better idea. By the time Karen would realize what was happening, it would be too late. The water would already be choosing its new route. Her precious shared dock space would be left sitting beside a dry, useless gully. And I would be fishing peacefully from my new perch overlooking a private, pristine channel lined with reeds, fish, and quiet. A new bench would go there too, just like before. With Ellen's name carved into the wood, this time higher and stronger than ever. Because you can steal a dock. But you'll never steal a river from an engineer with a broken heart. The morning after I filed the last of the permit applications, I stood barefoot in the cool dew of my backyard and stared at the winding ribbon of river like it was a canvas. The water shimmered under the early light, reflecting back the trees and the sky with perfect indifference. It didn't care about HOAs, power-hungry Karens, or fraudulent map. It just flowed where gravity told it to. And I was about to give gravity a nudge it would never forget. But first, I needed help. Not from lawyers or surveyors, but from someone who knew the stakes, the math, and the muscle. So I called Todd. Todd Jackson was an old Army buddy, and like me, he had retired early. We had served together in a combat engineering unit where we learned how to build bridges, dismantle roads, and, more importantly, reroute rivers in hostile environments. Todd had gone into environmental consulting after his military years and now ran a quiet firm that helped rehabilitate wetlands and design green infrastructure for city parks. He owed me a favor from back when I helped him out of a bind with an old zoning dispute on his property. I didn't have to explain much. When I told him, Karen and the HOA had stolen my dock and that I wanted to make the river forget they existed, Todd laughed so hard he choked on his coffee and said, "I'll bring my boots and bourbon." 2 days later, Todd arrived with a trailer loaded with drones, sensors, and a topographic scanner that looked like something out of a spy movie. We spent the first night on my back porch drinking bourbon and trading war stories. Then we got serious. We walked the bank, flew the drones overhead, and mapped the elevation drop from the river's upstream bend to a low marshy channel that ran parallel to the HOA lot. It wasn't deep or obvious, but it was there. A relic of an old oxbow that had long since dried up. It was perfect. The plan wasn't to dig a trench overnight and call it a river. That would be too obvious. Too reckless. We were going to shape the land in a way that made the new channel the easier, more attractive path for the water. Nature does the heavy lifting when you give it a better option. We'd start with shallow grading, add a few erosion buffers, cut a few dead trees for space, and install a weir system that gently encouraged the water to trickle down the new slope. With enough rain and time, the river would do what rivers have always done. It would change course. And when it did, it would leave the HOA's fake community dock staring at a weed-choked mud basin instead of water. Before we started breaking ground, I filed 3 more permits. One for erosion control, one for environmental restoration of the old oxbow, and one for invasive species management. All of it was perfectly legal. The county inspector came by, saw Todd's professional stamp on the documents, nodded in approval, and left within 15 minutes. We were careful. We didn't move too fast. We made sure every shovel of dirt looked like part of an ecological plan, not a vendetta, because if Karen ever caught wind of what we were doing, she'd send in lawyers, drones, and probably the fire department claiming we were violating noise ordinances. But Karen had bigger problems at the time. The HOA was preparing for their summer regatta, a laughably pompous event where they paraded rented boats down the river in pastel polo shirts while sipping cheap champagne and pretending they owned the water. This year's theme was river royalty. Karen had sent out laminated flyers with her face printed on the front in a plastic tiara. It was perfect. While she was busy polishing her paddle boat crown, we were laying out survey flags and adjusting berms along the new riverbed. Every time we made an adjustment, the water shifted ever so slightly in our favor. By the second week, the current had begun to lean into the new channel. Just a few gallons at first. Then a steady trickle. We reinforced the downstream edge with gravel and native reeds to prevent erosion and mask the human interference. It looked natural. It felt natural. Birds started showing up. Fish too. It was working. And nobody noticed. Until one of Karen's minions, a guy named Lester with the personality of a beige filing cabinet, came snooping around. Lester lived 2 houses down from Karen and considered himself the compliance officer for the HOA, which really meant he liked to walk around with a clipboard and pretend he had authority. He showed up on my side of the river one morning with a camera phone and asked what kind of project I was running. I smiled, handed him a printed copy of the county permits, and said, "Just doing some wetlands rehab." He squinted at the paper like he couldn't read, then asked if the new trench was supposed to have water in it. I told him I wasn't sure, that nature would decide. He left mumbling something about reporting it to Karen, but I knew by the time they reacted, it would be too late. The river had already begun to whisper secrets to the new path. Meanwhile, Karen was focused on the regatta, barking at HOA volunteers about balloon arrangements and snack tables. She sent out emails titled Urgent Dock Readiness Checklist and personally inspected each property's shoreline, including the muddy section where my dock had once stood. They had tried building a new platform there, but without proper anchors, it kept drifting. The HOA blamed the shifting water levels. Karen blamed me. She actually came by one afternoon, stood on my porch uninvited, and said, "You're awfully quiet these days." Planning anything, Glenn? I just sipped my tea and replied, enjoying the view. She narrowed her eyes and stomped off in heels unsuited for dirt. By the end of the month, the water was visibly choosing the new channel. The old path near the HOA home still flowed, but slower, shallower, browner. The new fork ran clear and cool through my land, birds singing from branches that hadn't seen wet soil in decades. It was poetic. It was quiet. But I knew the storm was coming. Todd and I installed one final touch. A small gate at the top of the new channel, disguised as part of the erosion control system. If needed, we could divert the full force of the river in a single night. But for now, we waited, smiled, and let nature take its course. The regatta was days away. And if our timing was right, Karen's floating castle of nonsense was about to discover what happens when you try to steal a dock from a man who built half the county's bridges and buried his wife beside one. The beauty of the plan wasn't in the destruction. It was in the elegance. No screaming matches. No lawsuit. No graffiti or vandalism. Just water, soil, patience, and justice. The river had always been there, waiting to be reminded of where it once flowed. And thanks to Karen's arrogance, it now had every reason to remember. The day of the regatta arrived with the kind of overcast sky that made everything feel more dramatic than it probably was. Karen had gone all out. White tents lined the HOA's riverfront lawns, helium balloons floated lazily in the breeze, and folding tables were stacked with finger foods labeled with gold calligraphy like smoked trout tartlets and lemon spritzers. A banner stretched between two cheap aluminum poles read Willow Creek Royal Regatta in scripted letters, and somewhere in the distance a Bluetooth speaker blasted classical music, trying way too hard to sound regal. Karen herself wore a sash and a ridiculous plastic tiara, like she'd just won prom queen at a yacht club for accountants. She smiled for photos, waved to neighbors, and gave speeches about unity, pride, and shared waterfront values. The irony was delicious. Todd and I watched from the far bank, just out of view, sitting in foldable camping chairs with coffee mugs full of something much stronger than coffee. The new channel was flowing beautifully now, clear, confident, and deepening by the day. Todd had installed some monitoring sensors the night before, and they were already pinging steady water flow that outpaced the original bank. What used to be a minor trickle was now a full, gurgling stream wrapping around the outside of my property like an arm pulling the river away from the HOA's grasp. We didn't need to touch the gate at all. Gravity and good design were doing everything for us. The regatta officially began at noon. A mix of paddleboats, kayaks, and a couple of rented pontoons made their grand entrance from the upstream curve, festooned with ridiculous decorations. One couple had even put a crown on their golden retriever and positioned him at the bow of their boat like some kind of river prince. The whole parade glided toward the HOA dock area, where Karen stood waiting like she expected to knight someone with a pool noodle. And that's when it happened. The first boat, a gold and white kayak with silk ribbons, tried to turn into the community dock area and immediately ran aground. The guests on board didn't realize it at first. They paddled harder, confused why they weren't moving. Then came the second boat, a rented fishing skiff, which got stuck even faster. The water near the HOA dock had dropped a good 8 inches in the past week alone, and now the once scenic launch site had turned into a weedy mess. Mud glistened where water had once sparkled, and the shore was lined with dry, cracked earth. Fish flopped helplessly in tiny puddles where Karen's great regatta centerpiece was supposed to land. People started shouting from their boats, asking if they'd taken a wrong turn. Karen waved her arms and insisted they come to shore anyway, but several guests hesitated, clearly not wanting to get their feet muddy. One guy stepped out of his boat and sank ankle-deep into the sludge, slipping and splattering mud across his khakis. His wife let out a high-pitched shriek that could have cracked glass. More people tried to reroute back upstream, but the current had already started tugging them toward my side, the new channel. From where we sat, the view was perfect. Water flowed smooth and steady under the makeshift wooden bridge Todd had built the week prior. We'd even planted cattails and water lilies to make it look naturally beautiful. A few confused boaters floated by, looking amazed at how much cleaner and more alive my side of the river looked. One group even asked if it was part of the regatta route. I shrugged and told them I wasn't sure, but they were welcome to enjoy the ride. They waved back and drifted peacefully downstream, past where I planned to rebuild my dock. Karen, meanwhile, was melting down. I could see her from across the river, pacing in front of the half-finished HOA dock platform that sat crooked on unstable support. Her face had gone from smug to panicked in under 15 minutes. She barked orders at Lester and 2 other HOA officers who scrambled to fetch rubber boots and towels for the guests who had stepped into mud. The speaker system started cutting in and out, playing classical music overlaid with awkward microphone feedback. Somewhere in the chaos, the tiara fell off Karen's head, landing in a pile of wet rivergrass. Todd raised his mug in salute. By mid-afternoon, the HOA shoreline had emptied. People who had tried to picnic near the dock retreated to their homes. One of the pontoon captains reversed his rental boat entirely and floated to the new stream by my property, asking where the river fork led. I told him it looped gently back to the main bend and had a nice view of some restored wetlands. He seemed delighted. I didn't have to gloat. The water was doing it for me. That evening, just before sunset, Karen came marching across the footbridge I'd installed weeks ago. It was technically on public land between our lots, and she took full advantage of that to storm up to my yard. She didn't knock. She just shouted, "What have you done to the river, Glenn?" Her voice cracked with anger. I stood on the porch with a cup of tea, same spot where I'd stood the day they tore my dock apart. "I haven't done anything illegal," I said evenly. "Just restoring old land features and managing erosion." She screamed that I was diverting water. I showed her the permits again. She threatened to sue. I told her she was welcome to try. The next day she did exactly that. A letter came from the HOA's legal counsel claiming I had intentionally altered river flow and caused damage to community property. It was hilarious. I sent them copies of my permits, hydrology reports from Todd's firm, and a side note that any accusations would need to be filed with the county. 2 days later, the county's water management office replied with a formal letter stating that my restoration project was not only legal but praised for its positive environmental impact. Karen must have screamed when she read that. The rest of the HOA board started to crack. At the next community meeting, a few members demanded to know why their expensive new dock had no water and why HOA funds were used to destroy mine in the first place. Lester tried to defend Karen, but his voice was shaking. Someone mentioned the word fraud. Karen left the meeting early. That same night, her house went dark. No twinkle lights. No barking orders from the front porch. Just silence. I stood by the river the next morning, watching the sunrise. Birds fluttered in the reeds by the new channel, and I spotted a heron dipping its beak into the water. The land looked healthier than it had in years. The old oxbow was now a living, flowing part of the river once more, and the fish had returned like they'd never left. I walked to the spot where Ellen's bench used to sit and placed a new plank down, still unfinished, but ready. It would take time to rebuild everything they stole. But I had the time. And now I had the river back. The weeks after the regatta unraveled like a slow-motion train wreck for Karen and the HOA. On the surface, things looked calm. Mowed lawns, quiet cul-de-sacs, and neighbors still waving politely during morning walks. But underneath, something had cracked. Word spread fast that the regatta had been a disaster, not because of rain or scheduling issues, but because the river, the very thing the event was built around, had chosen a new path. And that path had nothing to do with the HOA's plans. Rumors swirled. Some thought it was natural erosion. Others suspected sabotage. But a few clever residents, ones with an ounce of common sense and a dash of curiosity, started asking real questions. They traced the issue back to the demolished dock, the redirected channel, and eventually to Karen's questionable authority. And just like that, the HOA's golden mask started to slip. The first real blow came from a local journalist named Rachel Lee. She wasn't a big-name reporter, just a sharp freelancer who lived a few towns over and had a reputation for digging into community scandals. Apparently, one of the disgruntled HOA members had tipped her off anonymously, claiming their president had used association funds to destroy private property and lied about boundary lines. Rachel showed up on my porch one breezy afternoon with a recorder, a notepad, and a calm, curious smile. She wasn't aggressive. She just wanted the story. I offered her a chair and a glass of iced tea and laid it all out, one careful fact at a time. I showed her the old land surveys, the deeds, the original dock permits, and the forged reclassification notice the HOA had slipped under my door. I pointed out the deliberate redrawing of boundaries, how the HOA's legal reach never actually included my land, and how Karen had bulldozed my dock under a false claim of community right. I then showed her the River Channel project. Every permit, every environmental form, every county stamp of approval. Rachel took notes like she was sketching a masterpiece. When I told her about Ellen, about the bench, and about the way Karen smiled as the backhoe tore through it, she didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly and clicked off the recorder. The story hit the local news site within 3 days. The headline read, HOA President accused of destroying private memorial dock amidst boundary dispute. It didn't take long for the article to spread. Comments poured in. People furious, shocked, others sharing their own stories about HOA overreach. The story even made it onto a regional news station for a brief spot on Community Watch, where they aired drone footage of the dried-up HOA dock and the flourishing new channel weaving through my property. Karen's name was everywhere, and none of it was good. Karen responded the only way she knew how, with more denial and bluster. She called an emergency HOA meeting, tried to discredit the article, and accused me of manipulating the press. But the damage was done. Several board members resigned in the days that followed, some quietly, others with full-throated disgust. One even published a public resignation letter, citing misuse of funds, abuse of authority, and falsified documentation as reasons for stepping down. The HOA's attorney dropped them as a client. Karen was suddenly very alone. Then came the audit. The county, under pressure from both residents and local media, opened a formal investigation into the HOA's activities. They started looking into how the community funds were allocated and whether Karen had overstepped her position. The records showed clear misappropriations, especially the payment to her nephew's company, which had supplied the crew and equipment that destroyed my dock. Even worse, some of the HOA's legal correspondence bore forged letterheads from the zoning department, which Karen had apparently printed herself. That crossed a very dangerous line. What started as petty HOA drama now looked suspiciously like fraud. At this point, Karen went silent. No more emails. No more speeches. No more passive-aggressive flags planted in lawns. Her house lights stayed off most nights. The HOA, now in complete disarray, cancelled all future events. Volunteers who once happily trimmed hedges and handed out newsletters now avoided each other's eyes. Residents started questioning dues. Someone created a group chat titled HOA Freedom Committee and floated the idea of dissolving the association altogether. For the first time, people stopped whispering and started shouting. Then the storm came. A real one. Mid-June brought one of the heaviest downpours the region had seen in years. The river swelled overnight, pushing against every bank, ditch, and culvert. But unlike the HOA shoreline, poorly managed, overbuilt, and weakened by years of landscaping and Karen's interference, my side held firm. Todd and I had reinforced the berms weeks ago, lining them with stone, root mesh, and native reed. The new channel expanded exactly as planned, absorbing the extra water with ease. On the HOA side, however, the old dock area collapsed completely. The river, no longer trickling through, became stagnant. Without flow, it turned into a shallow, sludgy basin. The storm dumped water everywhere, and with nowhere else to go, it flooded 3 of the riverside homes, including Karen's. I didn't celebrate. I just watched from my porch as emergency crews showed up. The fire department laid down sandbags. Karen stood on her driveway with rain-soaked papers in hand, screaming into a phone. Her porch furniture floated off into the flooded cul-de-sac like the last remnants of a lost kingdom. The river had spoken. It had no interest in serving anyone's agenda but its own. The county's engineering team eventually released their report. The cause of flooding was a mixture of poor planning, erosion from illegal modifications to the bank, and outdated drainage systems installed during the HOA's expansion. In simpler terms, they did it to themselves. The report recommended several corrective actions, but the most biting part was a single paragraph buried on page 6. It stated that the upstream channel restoration, my project, had prevented further downstream flooding by absorbing excess flow and improving river health. My work had saved the rest of the valley, even as the HOA sank. Karen's final blow came from the court. My lawsuit, filed just days after the audit findings went public, moved forward like a freight train. Destruction of private property, trespassing, emotional damages, and a claim for the full cost of rebuilding the dock and Ellen's memorial. With no board to back her, no lawyer willing to take the case, and no credibility left, Karen folded. The settlement wasn't just a check. It was a public apology, signed and notarized, acknowledging every false action, every misuse of power, and every lie. I framed it, not out of spite, but as a reminder. A trophy of restraint, justice, and patience. Her house went up for sale shortly after. Some say she moved across the state. Others claim she fled to Florida under a new last name. I didn't care. The river had no memory for faces, only for flow. And it now flowed exactly where it belonged, free, wild, and untouchable. I spent the next week rebuilding the bench. The dock would come later. For now, I wanted that quiet place back. The one where Ellen used to sit, feet brushing the water, sketchbook in hand. As I set the new wood into place, I felt no anger. Just a calm satisfaction that no board, no committee, no entitled neighbor could ever take this from me again. The river had returned home. And so had I. Summer waned, but the air around the neighborhood never quite cooled. Even after Karen vanished and the HOA's authority collapsed, the silence that settled over Willow Creek was thick with unease. The association still technically existed, but without leadership or credibility, it became nothing more than a hollow name printed on old newsletters that no one read anymore. Neighbors who once followed Karen like ducklings now looked embarrassed to make eye contact. Lawn flags disappeared. Community BBQs dried up. The little park where she used to hold mandatory fun meetings became just another overgrown lot with broken benches and rusting swings. But for me, everything had changed in the best way. The river had been reborn. The land had healed. And the memory of what they'd tried to take from me only made its return sweeter. Todd stuck around for a while, longer than he planned, actually. We spent mornings drinking coffee by the new channel and evenings fishing in silence, letting the water speak instead of us. He said it reminded him of being young again, when all a man needed was fresh air, a sturdy pair of boots, and something worth building. The channel had grown deeper with every rain, shaped by the same forces that shaped mountains and valleys. Fish darted through it now like they had always belonged. Ducks nested along the bank. Kids from neighboring farms started wandering over with fishing poles, curious about the new waterway they'd heard rumors about. I never turned them away. Let them learn what peace looks like. The dock I rebuilt wasn't anything fancy. It was sturdier than before, with cedar planks and rust-proof anchors, but it wasn't about showing off. It was about making things right. I placed it a little higher this time, just above the bend of the new current, where the sun set perfectly across the water. The bench came first, the one with Ellen's name carved in thick, deep lettering. I sealed it 3 times over, not just for protection, but because I wanted her memory to last longer than any storm. I planted wildflowers around it, the kind she used to sketch. Her favorite was blue phlox. I put that right at the base of the bench, and by late July, they bloomed so thick it looked like the whole ground had turned violet. One morning, a representative from the county's environmental board came by unannounced. She introduced herself as Lila and asked if she could walk the property. I didn't know what to expect, but I figured if the county wanted to shut it all down, they'd have done it already. She spent over an hour walking the banks, testing the water, studying the plant growth, and taking photos. Then she sat down beside me on the bench and said, "Honestly, this is one of the best natural water restorations we've seen in 10 years. She asked if I'd consider letting them use the site as a model example for sustainable land rehabilitation. I told her sure, as long as they left the bench alone and didn't bring any clipboards with suggested improvements. She laughed and agreed. A few weeks later, they installed a small informational plaque at the upstream bend. Nothing flashy. Just a simple sign explaining the project, with a line that read, designed and executed by local landowner Glenn Mercer in collaboration with environmental consultants. It didn't mention Karen. It didn't need to. The court settlement had arrived quietly. Karen's apology was already framed in my den, but the money came in stages. First, enough to rebuild the dock and bench. Then enough to cover legal fees and damages. Then came the largest piece. The amount the judge ordered as compensation for emotional distress and the loss of the original memorial structure. I didn't want the money, really, but I knew exactly what to do with it. I donated most of it to a river conservation trust that Ellen had supported back when she was alive. The rest I used to fund a local youth ecology program. They now visit my land once a month to learn about water flow, fish migration, and plant diversity. They come with notepads and questions, wide eyes and muddy boots, and I always greet them with a smile. That was the kind of legacy I wanted. Not revenge, not bitterness, just growth. The HOA was officially dissolved in early autumn. A final vote was held, though barely enough residents showed up to call it a meeting. Those who did looked relieved when it passed. Without Karen or the fear she used to instill, people started thinking differently. They began planting what they liked in their own yards, painting their fences without needing to submit paperwork, letting their dogs run a little freer. One neighbor even came by to shake my hand and thank me. He admitted he'd voted with the board out of fear of fines and gossip. I told him it was done. No grudges. Just water under the bridge. The final twist, though, came from the land registry office. A quiet, polite man in slacks knocked on my door holding a leather folder and a bundle of printed maps. He explained that the collapse of the HOA had triggered a review of the original property records, including the forged amendments Karen had submitted years ago. With those rescinded, a small parcel of land previously claimed by the association reverted to its original zoning. Turns out, that parcel included the strip of riverfront right next to my dock. The land they had tried to steal and call public space. The county now recognized it as part of my property again, retroactively and fully recorded. I thanked him, signed the papers, and once he left, I stood by the water and just laughed. The dock, the bench, the channel, every inch was mine again. Not by force, not by trickery, but by patience, planning, and a little help from gravity. One evening, as the sky turned gold and shadows stretched across the river, I sat alone on the bench with a cup of tea. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp soil. Across the channel, where Karen's old house used to glow with over-decorated lights and HOA pride, new owners had moved in. A young couple, kind, quiet, didn't care much for community politics. They waved to me once from their porch and kept to themselves. That was good enough. I didn't need apologies from everyone. I just needed peace. The river moved slow and steady, curling around my land like it had been born to do so. The sound of water flowing over stones, the rustle of reeds, the occasional splash of fish, it was all music. And in that moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just satisfaction. Not just victory. Something simpler. Wholeness. They had tried to erase a piece of my life. Instead, they carved a path for something stronger to grow in its place. Ellen's name gleamed faintly on the bench beside me, catching the last rays of sun. I raised my cup and whispered, "We're home again." The river murmured in agreement, curling onward through the land we'd loved, through the memories we'd built, and through the justice that flowed not from the court, but from the earth itself. It was quiet. It was right. And it was finally, completely mine.